He lost everything with one signature. The pen didn't shake, not because he was sure, but because he was tired, the kind of tired that settles into your bones after years of carrying things no one else can see. And when Ethan Cole handed the paper back across the table, he thought he was signing away a problem, not his entire life. The room had smelled faintly of polished wood and old coffee, sunlight cutting through half-closed blinds and thin, tired lines, dust drifting like something forgotten, and his brother had smiled, not wide, not cruel, just enough to feel wrong if you looked too long. "It's just temporary," he had said, voice calm, practiced, the kind of voice that didn't invite questions. Ethan didn't ask any. Maybe that was the moment everything slipped, not in the signing, but in the silence that followed, because sometimes betrayal doesn't arrive loud. It arrives quiet, dressed like help, and leaves before you realize the door is open. By the time the truth settled in, it was already too late. The house was no longer his. The bank account emptied. The calls, unanswered. Family, once loud and constant, had gone still, like a radio switched off mid-song. And all that remained in the echo was the soft, steady sound of paws against hardwood floors. Ranger didn't ask questions either. The German shepherd stood by the door, ears forward, amber eyes fixed on Ethan as if waiting for a command that never came. His coat, a deep sable brushed with black along the spine, caught the last light of the afternoon, and for a moment, he looked less like a dog and more like a shadow that refused to leave. "Guess it's just us now," Ethan muttered, voice rough, not from anger, but from something quieter, something closer to surrender. Ranger stepped closer, pressing his head gently against Ethan's hand, a weight both grounding and impossible to ignore. Outside, the air carried the scent of dry leaves and distant pine, a late fall evening settling in with that sharp edge that hinted winter wasn't far behind. The kind of cold that doesn't just touch your skin, but reminds you of everything you've lost. Ethan packed what little remained into the back of his old pickup, a truck that rattled more than it ran, its faded blue paint chipped like memory, and as he drove away, he didn't look back. Not because it didn't matter, but because it mattered too much. The road stretched long and quiet, cutting through miles of forgotten land, past gas stations that flickered like tired eyes and fields that held nothing but wind. Ranger sat in the passenger seat, alert, watching the world pass as if memorizing it, as if keeping track of what Ethan could no longer hold on to. Hours passed without a word, just the hum of the engine, the occasional crunch of gravel, and the low whistle of air slipping through a cracked window. It was somewhere deep into the forest, miles from anything that resembled a town, that Ethan saw it. A structure barely standing, hidden between tall pines that leaned like silent witnesses. The shack looked like it had been left behind by time itself, its roof sagging under years of weather, boards warped and darkened, windows broken or missing entirely. It wasn't a place people chose. It was a place people ended up when there were no choices left. Ethan killed the engine, the sudden silence pressing in around them, thick and heavy. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ranger let out a low breath, not a bark, not a warning, just a quiet acknowledgement of something unseen. Ethan stepped out, boots sinking slightly into damp earth, the scent of rot and pine wrapping around him like an old memory he couldn't place. He stood there, staring at the shack, feeling something shift deep inside his chest. Not hope, not yet, but maybe the space where hope used to live. "It's not much," he said softly, more to himself than to the dog. Ranger jumped down beside him, steady, present, his gaze moving from the structure back to Ethan as if to say it didn't matter what it was, only that they were here. The wind moved through the trees, carrying a low, steady whisper, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, Ethan didn't feel completely alone. Not fixed, not healed, but not alone. And sometimes, that's where rebuilding begins. The first night did not feel like survival. It felt like waiting. The kind of waiting that stretches between breaths, where every sound matters more than it should. The shack groaned under its own weight as the temperature dropped, wood contracting in slow, tired creaks, and the wind slipped through the broken seams like it had been living there long before them. Ethan stood in the doorway for a long time before stepping inside, as if crossing that threshold meant accepting something he was not ready to name. The air carried the thick scent of damp wood and old earth, layered with something metallic and faint, like forgotten tools left too long in the rain. Ranger moved first, slow and deliberate, paused silent against the warped floorboards, his nose low, reading the room in a way Ethan could not. His ears twitched at every shift in sound, every whisper of movement hidden in the walls, and yet he did not retreat. That was enough. Ethan exhaled, long and quiet, then followed. The floor sagged slightly under his weight, a soft warning, but it held. Barely. He set his bag down near what used to be a fireplace, its stone frame cracked but still standing, and for a moment he just looked around, taking it in piece by piece, like a soldier surveying unfamiliar ground. A broken chair leaned against the far wall, one leg missing, its shadow stretching thin in the fading light. A table sat near the center of the room, scarred and uneven, as if it had been repaired too many times to remember its original shape. And above it all, the ceiling dipped where the roof had begun to give, a dark stain spreading outward like a quiet warning of what would come with the next heavy rain. "We have seen worse," Ethan said under his breath, though he was not entirely sure that was true anymore. Ranger stopped near the center of the room and turned back to him, holding his gaze for a second longer than usual, not questioning, not doubting, just present. That steadiness did something small but real. Ethan nodded once, more to himself than to the dog, and got to work. He found an old tarp in the back of the truck, stiff from disuse, and dragged it inside, spreading it across the driest patch of floor he could find. The motion was simple, repetitive, grounding in a way nothing else had been all day. Pull, shake, press it flat. Again. Ranger circled once before settling near the edge, his body angled toward the door, instinct still set to guard even here, even now. Outside, the last light drained from the sky, replaced by a deep blue that settled over the trees like a blanket too thin to keep anything warm. The forest changed with the dark. What had been quiet became layered, distant rustles, the occasional snap of a branch, the low, constant breath of wind moving through pine needles high above. Ethan sat down slowly, back against the wall, feeling the cold seep through his jacket, and for the first time since the drive, the weight of it all caught up to him. Not the loss itself. That had already happened. This was something else. The after. The part no one prepares you for. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the only thing he had kept without thinking, a worn set of dog tags, the metal dulled from years of wear, edges smoothed by time and touch. They caught what little light remained, reflecting it in a soft, uneven flicker. He held them for a moment, thumb tracing the familiar grooves, then let them rest in his palm. Ranger shifted slightly, pressing closer, the warmth of his body cutting through the cold just enough to be noticed. Ethan glanced down, a faint breath of something like a smile touching his expression before fading just as quickly. "We will fix it," he said quietly, not to convince the dog, but to convince himself. The words did not echo. They settled. Outside, the wind picked up, brushing against the walls with a low, steady rhythm, and somewhere in that sound, there was a strange kind of promise. Not that it would be easy, not that it would be quick, but that it would be possible. Ethan leaned his head back against the rough wood, eyes half closing, listening to the rhythm of Ranger's breathing, steady and sure, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart, sleep did not feel like something he had to fight for. It came slowly, quietly, like a small mercy that did not ask permission. Morning did not arrive all at once. It slipped in slowly, pale light filtering through the broken edges of the shack, touching the warped boards, and settling in the corners like something unsure of its welcome. Ethan woke before the sun fully cleared the trees, not because he was rested, but because his body had learned long ago that waiting too long made things harder. The cold had not left. It lingered in the floor, in the walls, in the quiet spaces between breaths. Ranger was already awake. He stood near the doorway, still and alert, his silhouette framed by the thin gray light outside, ears forward, watching the forest as if it might speak first. Ethan pushed himself up, joints stiff, the tarp beneath him rustling softly, and for a moment he just sat there, listening. No engines, no voices, just wind moving through branches and the distant call of something unseen. It was a different kind of silence. Not empty, just honest. He stepped outside, boots pressing into damp soil, the air sharper now, carrying the scent of pine and cold earth. The shack looked worse in daylight. What had been shadow and suggestion the night before was now clear. The roof sagged deeper than he thought, one side dipping enough to collect rainwater. Several boards along the outer wall had split completely, leaving narrow gaps that let light pass through like thin blades. The front steps leaned slightly to the left, uneven, unstable. It was not just worn. It was tired. The kind of tired that comes from being left alone too long. Ethan exhaled slowly, hands resting on his hips, eyes tracing every flaw, every weakness, measuring without tools, calculating without numbers. "All right," he said quietly. "One piece at a time." Ranger stepped out beside him, shaking off the cold with a brief ripple through his coat, then moved along the perimeter, nose low, checking the ground, the corners, the edges where structure met earth. He paused near the side of the shack, sniffing longer than before, then glanced back once, as if marking the spot for later. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. There would be time for that. Right now, there was work. He started with what he could control. The loose boards by the door came first. He pried them free carefully, testing each one before pulling, saving what could still be used, setting aside what could not. The motion was slow, deliberate, not rushed. Every nail removed, without snapping, felt like a small victory. Every board salvaged meant one less problem later. Ranger stayed close, moving when Ethan moved, settling when he stopped, a quiet presence that filled the spaces words would have taken. Hours passed without notice. The sun climbed higher, pushing warmth through the trees in thin, uneven patches, never enough to feel comfortable, but enough to keep the edge off. Ethan found a rhythm. Pull, stack, measure, adjust. It was not the kind of work that solved everything, but it was the kind that started something. At one point, he paused, wiping his hands against his jeans, and looked at what he had done. It was not much. A cleared section near the entrance. A small pile of usable wood. The door, now able to close without catching. But it was different. Subtle, but real. The shack no longer looked completely abandoned. It looked like someone had decided it mattered again. Ranger let out a soft breath and stepped closer, sitting beside him, his gaze following Ethan's out toward the tree line. For a moment, neither moved. The forest held its quiet, steady as before, but there was something else now. Not a sound. Not yet. Just a sense that the place was not entirely finished revealing itself. Ethan reached down absent-mindedly, resting his hand against Ranger's neck, fingers sinking slightly into thick fur, grounding himself in something certain. "We keep going," he said, voice low, steady, more sure than the night before. Ranger did not move. He did not need to. The agreement was already there. As the light shifted and the shadows shortened, Ethan picked up another board, set it in place along the outer wall, and pressed it firm, testing its hold. It creaked, but it held. Not perfect, not strong, but enough. And sometimes, enough is where everything begins. By the second day, the work began to change him. Not in ways anyone else would notice, but in the small adjustments that only a man feels when he starts to stand a little straighter without realizing it. The morning air carried a sharper bite, just above freezing, the kind that made every breath visible for a second before disappearing into nothing, and Ethan moved through it with quiet purpose, his hands already sore, knuckles scraped raw in places where the wood had resisted him the day before. Ranger stayed close, never in the way, always where he needed to be, like a shadow that understood direction before it was spoken. The shack no longer felt entirely foreign. It still groaned when the wind pushed against it, still whispered through its cracks, but now there were signs of effort, boards aligned where they had once leaned. The door set a little straighter on its hinges, the ground near the entrance cleared of debris and old leaves. It was not fixed, but it was no longer forgotten. Ethan moved to the side wall where Ranger had paused the day before, the spot still marked faintly by disturbed soil and a subtle difference in scent that only the dog had fully understood. He crouched, pressing his hand against the wood, feeling the cool dampness beneath his fingers, and for a moment he stayed there, still, listening. Not for sound, but for something deeper, something he could not name yet. "You felt something here," he said quietly, glancing at Ranger. The dog did not bark. He simply stepped forward and placed his paw against the ground near the base of the wall, then pulled it back and looked up, steady and certain. Ethan nodded once. That was enough. He found a rusted shovel near the back of the shack, half buried under fallen branches, the handle worn smooth from years of use, and tested its weight before pressing it into the soil. The ground resisted at first, compacted from seasons of rain and cold, but it gave slowly, inch by inch, each push requiring more effort than the last. Dirt lifted in uneven clumps, dark and heavy, releasing the scent of earth that had not been disturbed in a long time. Ranger stayed close, circling once, then sitting just beyond the edge of the shallow pit, watching, ears forward, eyes focused not on Ethan, but on the ground itself. Time passed in that quiet rhythm. Dig, lift, toss aside, repeat. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the trees in narrow beams that caught the floating dust and turned it into something almost visible, like the forest itself was watching. Ethan wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve, leaving a faint streak of dirt across his skin, and paused, the shovel resting against the edge of the hole. It was not deep, maybe a foot and a half, but something had changed. The soil felt different now, less compact, more layered, as if something had been placed there long ago and the ground had slowly closed around it. He drove the shovel in again, slower this time, more careful, and felt it catch against something that was not rock. The sound was dull, muted, not the sharp crack of stone, but something hollow, something that did not belong to the earth. Ethan froze, the handle still in his grip, heart not racing, but steady in a way that felt heavier than fear. Ranger stood immediately, stepping closer to the edge, his posture shifting, alert but not alarmed, as if confirming what he had known all along. Ethan set the shovel aside and knelt, brushing away the loose dirt with his hands, fingers moving carefully, uncovering edges, lines, shape. Metal, worn, rusted in places, but still solid beneath the decay. A box, not large, maybe 2 feet across, buried deliberately, not lost, not discarded. Placed. He sat back slightly, exhaling slowly, the air leaving his chest in a measured breath as he looked down at it. Someone wanted this hidden, he murmured. Ranger lowered his head, nose hovering just above the surface, not touching, just close enough to feel the presence of it. The forest around them remained quiet, but it felt different now, not empty, waiting. Ethan rested his hand on the edge of the box, feeling the cold metal beneath his palm, and for a moment, he did not open it. Not yet, because something told him that whatever lay inside was not just something left behind. It was something meant to be found, and finding it would change more than just this place. He does not open it right away. That is the first thing that changes. The old version of Ethan would have rushed, hands already prying at the edges, needing answers, needing something to fill the silence. But this time, he just sits there, dirt still clinging to his fingers, the cold metal of the box steady beneath his palm, and he breathes. Slow, measured, like he has learned that some things reveal themselves better when you do not force them. Ranger lowers himself beside the shallow pit, body angled toward the forest, but his eyes remain fixed on the box, not restless, not impatient, just certain. The wind shifts slightly, carrying the scent of pine and something older, something buried deeper than the soil itself, and Ethan finally moves. He brushes away the last layer of dirt, clearing the edges, exposing the full shape. The box is heavier than it looks, corners reinforced, lid sealed tight by time and corrosion. It was meant to last. That much is clear. All right, he murmurs. Voice low, almost respectful, as if whatever is inside deserves that much. He grips the edge and pulls. The box does not budge at first. He adjusts, digs his fingers underneath, using the shovel to loosen the soil around it, working carefully, not wanting to damage what he does not yet understand. It takes several minutes, each movement deliberate, until finally the box shifts, just enough to break free from the grip of the earth. He exhales softly and lifts it, muscles tightening under the strain, and sets it down on the ground beside the hole. Ranger leans forward slightly, nose hovering close, inhaling once, then pulling back, ears flicking as if confirming something unseen. Ethan studies the lid. There is no lock, no visible mechanism, just a seam where metal meets metal, worn but intact. He runs his thumb along the edge, feeling for resistance, for weakness, for a place to begin. Let us see what you were hiding, he says quietly, and this time there is something else in his voice. Not desperation, Not fear. Something closer to readiness. He wedges the tip of the shovel beneath the lid and applies steady pressure. The metal groans, a low, reluctant sound, as if it has not been opened in years. For a moment, nothing happens. Then, slowly, the seal gives. A thin line appears. Air slips in. The lid lifts just enough. Ethan pauses, hand resting against the cold surface, and glances at Ranger. The dog meets his gaze, steady, unflinching. That is all the permission he needs. He pulls the lid open. Inside, the first thing he notices is not what is there, but how carefully it has been preserved. Everything is wrapped, protected, layered in oilcloth that has held back time as best it could. He reaches in, fingers brushing against the fabric, and lifts the top layer away. Beneath it, papers, stacked, bound together with a strip of leather that has dried and cracked, but still holds. He sets them aside gently, not opening them yet, and looks deeper. There is more. A smaller box inside the larger one, wooden, its surface worn smooth, edges darkened with age. And beneath that, something else. Metal again, but not like the outer case. This is cleaner, more deliberate. A container meant not just to protect, but to preserve importance. Ethan's breath slows again, that same measured rhythm, as if he understands without fully knowing that this is no accident. This was placed here for a reason. Ranger shifts slightly, moving closer, his presence pressing against Ethan's side, grounding him in the moment. Ethan lifts the bundle of papers first, fingers careful as he unties the leather strip. The pages inside are thick, official, marked with seals that have faded but not disappeared. He scans the top page, eyes moving quickly at first, then slowing as the words begin to settle into meaning. Names, dates, signatures, ownership records. His brow tightens, not in confusion, but in recognition of something that does not fit. This land, he murmurs, voice barely above a breath. He flips to the next page. More documents, transfers, agreements. But something is wrong. The names do not match what he was told. The history does not align with the story he had believed. Ranger lets out a low, quiet sound, not a growl, not a warning, just a note of awareness, as if he feels the shift before Ethan fully understands it. Ethan lowers the papers slightly, eyes fixed on the lines in front of him, and for the first time since he found the box, something sharp flickers beneath the calm. Not anger, not yet, but clarity, the kind that cuts through everything else. They knew, he says softly. Not a question, not a guess, a realization. The forest remains still around them, but it no longer feels empty. It feels like it has been holding this moment, waiting for it, and now that it has arrived, there is no going back to what was before. The realization does not explode. It settles, quiet and heavy, like snow that does not look dangerous until it starts to weigh everything down. Ethan keeps reading, each page turning slower than the last, his fingers no longer searching but confirming. The documents are not random. They tell a sequence. Ownership passed down, not through strangers, not through distant names, but through a line he recognizes. His family, not in the way they told it, not in the way they made it sound when they said the land had been lost years ago, sold off, gone beyond reach. That was never true. The signatures say otherwise. The dates hold steady. The land, this land beneath his boots, was never meant to leave that line. It was meant to stay. Ranger shifts closer, pressing his shoulder lightly against Ethan's arm, a quiet anchor as the weight of the truth settles deeper. Ethan lowers the papers into his lap, eyes fixed on one name that appears more than once, older ink, steadier handwriting, someone who had cared enough to keep things in order. He turns another page. There, near the bottom, a clause. Not obvious, not bold, but final. A note about contingency, about inheritance, about protection. His jaw tightens slightly, not from anger, but from understanding. It was supposed to come to me, he says, voice low, almost lost in the wind. Not because he wanted it, not because he asked, but because it had already been decided long before he ever signed anything. Ranger exhales softly, his gaze moving from the papers to Ethan's face, watching the shift happen in real time. The betrayal is no longer just a feeling. It has shape now, structure, evidence. Ethan sets the papers aside carefully and reaches for the smaller wooden box inside the metal case. It fits in his hands with a strange familiarity, as if it was made to be held, not hidden. The surface is worn smooth, edges softened by time, but the lid opens easily, as if it has been waiting. Inside, there is no money, no gold, nothing loud, just a few objects, placed with intention. A ring. Simple. Gold, but not polished. Worn in a way that suggests years of use, not display. Beside it, a folded letter, paper aged but intact, sealed once, but now loose. Ethan hesitates, not out of fear, but out of respect for something he does not yet understand. Ranger remains still, his presence steady, patient. Ethan picks up the letter. The paper feels fragile, but it holds. He unfolds it slowly, careful not to tear what time has already tested, and begins to read. The handwriting is different from the documents. Less formal, more personal. The kind of writing that carries weight not because of law, but because of truth. His eyes move across the lines, and with each word, the silence around him deepens. The letter speaks of trust, of intention, of a decision made quietly, away from the noise of others. It speaks of a belief that some things should not be taken, only passed on to those who would understand their value. Not in dollars, not in acres, but in what they represent. Ethan's breathing slows again, but this time it is not from effort. It is from something else, something steadier. The kind of calm that comes when confusion finally gives way to clarity. He lowers the letter slightly, eyes lingering on the final lines, and for a moment, he says nothing. Ranger shifts closer, resting his head lightly against Ethan's knee, the contact grounding, real. Ethan looks down at him, a faint change in his expression, not quite a smile, but something softer than what came before. They thought I would walk away, he says quietly, that I would not look deeper. The wind moves through the trees again, carrying that same low, steady whisper, but now it feels different. Not empty, not uncertain. It feels like something has been returned to its place. Ethan folds the letter carefully and sets it back inside the box, placing the ring beside it, not claiming it yet, not rejecting it either, just acknowledging it. He looks back at the shack, the uneven walls, the patched boards, the work still waiting to be done, and for the first time, he does not see it as something temporary. He sees it as something chosen, something that was never meant to be abandoned. Ranger stands beside him as he rises, both of them turning toward the structure, toward the work, toward what comes next. The past has not disappeared, but it no longer holds the same weight, because now it has been understood, and that changes everything. He could have left that same day. The thought comes quietly, not as temptation, but as fact. The papers alone are enough to change everything, enough to step back into a world that suddenly makes room for him again, enough to call a lawyer, make a case, force the truth into the open where it cannot be ignored. Ethan knows this. He feels it in the weight of the documents now resting inside the shack, in the steady clarity that has replaced confusion. But he does not reach for his truck keys. He does not make a call. Instead, he picks up a hammer. The wood in his hands is rough, uneven, but it is real. It does not lie. It does not pretend. It either holds or it does not. Ranger watches him from a few feet away, head slightly tilted, as if measuring the choice before it is fully made. Ethan lines up the board along the outer wall, pressing it into place, testing its fit, adjusting it once, then again. The motion is steady, deliberate, almost quiet in its certainty. The first strike of the hammer echoes through the trees, sharp but not harsh, a sound that does not disturb the forest so much as join it. He drives the nail in with controlled force, not rushed, not angry, just precise. Another strike, then another, each one anchoring something more than wood. Ranger steps closer, circling once before settling near the base of the wall, his body angled outward, always aware of the space beyond, always guarding even when there is nothing obvious to guard against. The day moves forward in that rhythm. Fix one section, step back, assess, adjust, move to the next. The roof comes first. Ethan climbs carefully, testing each step, each shift in weight, the old structure creaking beneath him, but holding just enough to allow the work. He replaces what he can, reinforces what he cannot, using salvaged boards, measured cuts, and the kind of patience that does not come from skill alone, but from necessity. The sun rises higher, pushing warmth through the branches and scattered patches, and for the first time since he arrived, Ethan feels it fully. Not just on his skin, but in his chest. A quiet heat. Not excitement. Not relief. Something steadier. Something earned. Ranger moves below, tracking Ethan's position without looking directly up, always aware, always present. At one point, he pauses again near the place where the box had been buried, his nose brushing the ground lightly, then lifting, as if acknowledging that what needed to be found has already been brought into the light. Ethan notices from above, but does not stop. There is no urgency now, only direction. By late afternoon, the shack begins to change in ways that are visible even from a distance. The roof no longer dips as sharply. The wall no longer leans as far. The door closes with less resistance, its frame steadier, more aligned. It is still worn, still imperfect, but it stands differently, like something that has decided not to give in. Ethan steps down from the roof slowly, boots hitting the ground with a dull, grounded sound. And for a moment, he just stands there, looking at what he has done. It is not complete, not even close, but it is no longer broken in the same way. Ranger approaches, stopping beside him, their shoulders nearly aligned, both facing the same direction. The forest stretches out ahead, quiet and unchanged, but it no longer feels like something distant. It feels like something they are part of now. Ethan wipes his hands against his jeans, leaving faint streaks of dust and dirt, and exhales, long and steady. "We stay," he says, voice calm, not a decision made in the moment, but one that has already taken root. Ranger does not move. He does not need to. The agreement is already there, written not in words, but in presence. The papers inside the shack remain untouched for now, their weight no less real, their truth no less powerful, but they no longer define the next step. Because for the first time since everything fell apart, Ethan is not reacting. He is choosing, and that changes the shape of everything that comes next. The third morning arrives without announcement, just a slow brightening of the sky that slips through the repaired gaps in the walls, softer now, less intrusive, as if the light itself recognizes the change. Ethan is already awake, sitting on the edge of the makeshift bed, the papers spread out beside him in careful order, no longer hidden, no longer ignored. Ranger rests nearby, head lifted, watching not the door this time, but Ethan, as if the real movement is happening inside the man, not outside the shack. Ethan runs his fingers once more over the top page, tracing the lines that have already settled into certainty, and then he stops. Not because he doubts them, but because he no longer needs to prove them. "It is enough," he says quietly, folding the documents with deliberate care, placing them back into the metal box, not as something to be buried again, but as something to be kept without urgency. Ranger exhales softly, a small shift in his posture, like a weight has lifted that was never visible, but always there. Outside, the forest carries on the same as before, wind moving through branches, distant birds calling out in uneven rhythm, but now it feels different, not because it has changed, but because Ethan has. He steps out onto the front of the shack, the boards beneath his boots holding firm, not perfect, but steady, and pauses. The truck sits where he left it, quiet, patient, a path back to everything he could reclaim if he chose to. He looks at it for a long moment, not with longing, not with hesitation, just recognition. That road is still there, but it is no longer the only one. Ranger steps beside him, sitting at the edge of the small porch, gaze forward, calm, grounded. Ethan nods once, almost to himself, then turns away from the truck and back toward the shack. The decision does not feel dramatic. It feels settled. He moves through the space with purpose now, not testing, not guessing, but building. The interior comes next. He clears the remaining debris, stacking what can be used, discarding what cannot, creating space where there was once only clutter and collapse. Each movement is quieter than the day before, more efficient, more certain. Ranger follows the rhythm, shifting when needed, resting when stillness is called for, always close enough to touch, never in the way. Hours pass without notice. The sun climbs, the air warms slightly, and the shack begins to hold something it did not before. Not just structure, not just repair, something else, something lived in. Ethan pauses near the doorway, looking out across the trees, the light now steady, no longer thin or uncertain, and for a moment he allows himself to stand still, not because he is tired, but because he can. The past remains what it was. The betrayal does not disappear. The truth does not soften. but it no longer directs him. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out the dog tags again, the metal catching the light in a small, quiet reflection, and this time, when he looks at them, there is no weight behind it. Just memory. He closes his hand around them briefly, then lets them fall back against his chest. Ranger stands beside him, leaning slightly into his leg, the contact familiar now, expected. Ethan rests his hand on the dog's head, fingers pressing lightly into the fur, and exhales, slow and steady. "We build it right," he says, voice calm, certain. Ranger does not move. He does not need to. The answer is already there. And in that quiet moment, with the forest breathing around them and the shack standing just a little stronger than before, Ethan understands something simple and final. Some things are taken. Some things are given back. But the ones that matter most are the ones you choose to build with your own hands. The days stop counting themselves after that. Time no longer feels like something slipping away, but something being laid down, piece by piece, like the boards beneath Ethan's hands. The shack changes slowly, not in sudden transformations, but in quiet corrections. A straightened beam, a sealed gap, a roof that no longer leaks when the early morning frost melts into thin drops of water that slide down instead of seeping through. Ranger moves through it all like he belongs there, not as a guest, not as something temporary, but as part of the structure itself, his presence woven into every moment, every decision, every pause. The forest begins to recognize them too, not in words, not in gestures, but in the way it stops feeling distant. The wind does not push as hard. The silence does not press as heavy. It becomes something shared. One afternoon, weeks later, Ethan stands at the edge of the clearing, the finished porch behind him, the repaired walls catching the late sunlight in warm, steady tones. The shack no longer looks like something abandoned. It looks like something chosen, something kept. Ranger sits beside him, posture relaxed, eyes half narrowed against the light, breathing slow and even. Ethan holds the letter again, the paper no longer fragile in his hands, but familiar. He has read it enough times now that he no longer needs to follow every line. He knows what it says. More importantly, he understands what it meant. He folds it once more and slips it back into the wooden box, placing it carefully inside the shack where it belongs, not hidden, not displayed, just present. The documents remain with it, untouched, not because they lack value, but because their value no longer defines him. A truck engine echoes faintly in the distance. Not close, not immediate, just a reminder that the outside world still moves, still turns, still expects things from people who once belonged to it. Ethan hears it. He does not turn. Ranger's ears flick once, acknowledging the sound, then settle again. The moment passes. The forest returns to its quiet rhythm. Ethan steps down from the porch and walks along the side of the shack, running his hand lightly along the wood, feeling the solidness beneath his palm, the difference between what was and what is now. There are still imperfections, slight bends, uneven lines, but they do not bother him. They tell the truth. They show the work. They hold the story. He stops near the place where the box had once been buried, the ground now leveled, no trace left of what had been hidden beneath it. For a moment, he stands there, looking down, not searching, not questioning, just remembering. Ranger joins him, standing close, his shoulder brushing lightly against Ethan's leg, a quiet, familiar contact that needs no explanation. Ethan exhales slowly, the breath leaving him without weight, without resistance. "We did not lose it," he says, voice low, steady. "We just had to find it the right way." Ranger does not move. He does not need to. The truth is already there, settled between them, not in the box, not in the papers, not even in the shack itself, but in what they chose to build when everything else was taken. The sun lowers behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing, the light turning softer, warmer, as the day begins to close. Ethan turns back toward the porch, toward the place that now holds more than just shelter, and steps forward without hesitation. Ranger follows, as he always has, as he always will. And in the quiet that settles after, there is no need for anything more. No proof, no return, no answer given to those who once turned away. Because some endings do not come with noise. They come with stillness, with something rebuilt that no one else can take. And in that stillness, for the first time, everything that mattered remains.